Welcome to the Season 3 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar and is presented by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from the rural India. This year's Conference of Parties COP28, hosted in the oil-rich UAE, was full of ironies. There were apprehensions over the host, which has oil wells in its backyard. The COP28 President was the CEO of the national oil company. It was expected that at least the rich nations would drive more climate finance. But the negotiations that unfolded over the 12 days and the outcome caught many by surprise. The COP final text for the first time mentioned a transition away from fossil fuels. The decision was lauded, but the fine print is not that promising. There was no major uptick in climate finance. Adaptation goals were left untouched, and the language towards the oil and gas sector was lopsided. To unfold the facets of the negotiations at COP28 and their impact on global climate dialogue and global warming, we talked with Jacob Koshy. Koshy is Deputy Science Editor at The Hindu and has been writing on science and technology for more than a decade. An engineer turned journalist, he has worked in some of the leading news dailies in India and is known for incisive reporting and comprehensive writing.
Hello, thank you, Jacob, for joining us here at the India Energy Hour. We are absolutely delighted to have you here. You're one of the foremost science writers in the country, and you've covered the climate sector, energy, everything that comes under it. And obviously, your writing has been an inspiration for, if I may say, young writers like me. Really insightful. So, who better than you to explain what all this COP drama was all about? You have covered a lot of COPs. This was one of them. So I'm sure
Sure.
we will have a very interesting discussion with you. And thank you again for joining us here.
My pleasure, Shreya. It's a absolute honor to be, on your podcast. I've listened to it. There are some people that I respect a lot, Anil Swaroop, and some of them who I've heard conversations. And it's a very interesting idea. And I'm glad to be able to speak to you and your audiences, on some of this.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
So we'll just delve into the conversation very quickly. It's an interesting topic, but before we jump into
Yes.
that, we want to focus on you. I always say whenever we have a fellow journalist on our podcast said that no one knows us beyond our bylines. I'm not sure even how many people read the byline below the headline. But given
Yes.
the length and breadth of the work that you have done, we are very interested to understand your journey. Where are you from? How did you land up in journalism? And of all sectors that were available into science journalism, where did you study? If you can tell us all
Yes.
about that. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm a person. I grew up in Ahmedabad. I did all my early schooling over there, and like like I'm a very '90s kid in the sense that I did well in math and science. So there were essentially two options available. So there is engineering and there is medicine. And for whatever reason, I couldn't draw well. I wasn't great at. I mean, I like biology, but I couldn't draw diagrams well. So I was like, medicine is certainly is not my thing. So I just went the engineering path, and went. I did my electrical engineering from National Institute of Technology in Orissa, and this was electronics and communication. So, but surprisingly, I mean, when I I did my engineering. I just realized that this was this was just an extension of school, in the sense that it was a good college, and I had it was for the first time that I met so many people from different states all across India. Here I'm a Malayali boy who grew up in Ahmedabad, and so that was my limited set of interactions that I had with in terms of exposing myself to the whole country. But I made so many friends and stuff like that over there. But in terms of education, it was just a lot of math, differential equations and integrals and calculus, and it was just an extension of that. Even in all most of our semesters of engineering, and beyond some time, I kind of got the feeling that this is not really a very exciting career path to go on. I actually, even though I was studying doing an engineering course, I ended up reading a lot more English literature actually, and did a lot of reading on philosophy, and in a college library, met a lot of like-minded friends, and towards the end, I was always generally quite keen on writing and going up on stage and being somebody who would add just do a 1 minute presentation on stuff like that. So that's always been my general nature. I enjoyed the cultural festivals in college much more than actual all the engineering stuff. And so by the time I came to final year, I kind of realized that and there was literally just one sector that most of my colleagues did. Either people went abroad and did masters in one of their in engineering or electronics, or they just joined IT. And when I graduated, that was a year when there was some kind of a bust happening. It was one of those boom bust cycles, which I wasn't aware of, but we all thought it was like some major catastrophe in life, that there is a IT bust happened. Abhi to there are no jobs and stuff like that. But anyway, I was one of those guys, I was like, I'm getting out of this. I need to do something connected to writing. Now, I wasn't the guy who would straight away go on to write a novel or something. I hadn't written something like that, but I also wanted to do a job. And I didn't know, how do you combine writing and a job? And I came back to Ahmedabad for 5 or 6 months. I was figuring this out, and suddenly somebody told me there are these colleges where they do journalism. Now I was like, journalism? I had never ever thought about it. I mean, my dad used to be an avid reader of the Times of India, and believe me, in my life, I used to always say, what this is so boring. There's something that I used to see this black line in front of other people, and on before an article. And honest to God, I've never actually bothered to see what is this thing called a byline. Who are these people? You just read the articles and then you just get ahead with it. And so one thing led to the other, and I decided to take some, write some entrance exams for a couple of well-known engineering, mass communication and journalism schools. And in fact, in one of those tests, I was asked, who's your favorite journalist? And I was very keen that I wanted to do print. I wanted to be writing. But I just realized I didn't know a single journalist who wrote in the print medium. And I just kind of said, oh, I like Barkhadat and Rajdeep Sardesai. So that was the level of my engagement with journalism at that point of time. But I sort of, I got through 2 schools, but the school that I eventually picked was a school in Kerala. Now, Kerala was a state that even though I'm from Kerala, I have always visited the place for vacations. And I have family over there. But it was a state that presented a lot of complexities in terms of its high literacy levels, high education levels, but also extreme joblessness, extreme migration patterns. And there is also the beautiful environment over there, but it is also a state with a history of communism and its intrafactional politics. So I just wanted to understand the state of my parents and my grandparents much better, because I was somebody who had essentially been a Gujarati boy who's kind of affiliated, who was born in Kerala. I wanted to understand things better, and that's how I chose to study journalism in Kerala. And it's here I met one of my most inspirational persons ever. He was a journalism professor called K. Thomas Uman. And he was this person, he comes from a very interesting lineage. I mean, he is somebody who's taught at the Times School in Delhi many, many years ago. Several prominent editors of Today were his proteges at some point of time. And he taught at the Asian College of Journalism in his founding batch, and he himself was a person who was traveled all across the world. But in his after retirement, in his twilight years, he's decided to come back to his home of Kottayam and be in a journalism school over there. And it was just coincidence that I'd heard about him and I thought, let me go to this. Let's see what this person has to offer. And believe me, it was one of the most life-changing things for because I always thought I was a great writer and I had talent with the language and I could play with words easily. But this was a person who absolutely shattered my illusions of language. I mean, he starts out our day saying that, so you all came over here because and chose journalism because nobody else would accept you anywhere, right? So that was one of his starting, talks to us as young journalism graduates. But he broke us down. He taught us how to write for newspapers, how to say a lot of stuff in just 100 words or 200 words, how to edit out the superfluous. And those are, and that kind of increased my love for language and, and writing precisely and tightly. I enjoyed that. And since then I have always been somebody, but I that's when I kind of resolved that, okay, I really like this field of print journalism and writing. But at some point I also had this whole thing that, hey, I've done this engineering bit, that I spent 4 years of my life doing. So how do I combine these two things? And I thought, there is this, I can write about science and technology and, bring in these aspects into my writing. And luckily for me, and I think this is a very unique experience, but luckily for me, every place, right from my first job, which was at the Week magazine, they always were interested in somebody who was passionate about covering science and, research, issues like that. So I didn't actually go through a classical entry-level journalism route in the sense that, you start out with the crime and the city reporting. I was straight away in a bureau and I was straight away writing already, on science. So I was fortunate in that. And literally every other paper that I went to, I was with the Mint newspaper, when they had just launched. And one of the editors, Sukumar Ranganathan, he was an absolute science geek person. I never had to pitch a science story. He would see my listing and it would just easily go on page one. And I had a great boss, Anil. He was somebody who recruited me just for being a science writer. So in that sense, I feel I've had a very privileged journey with science and science writing. I know a lot of people would go straight away into covering classical beats. They would be either doing politics or crime or sport or, try to get into the high profile energy sectors and all that. But I've always managed to, just be a little tangential in kinds of writing I do, get into science deeply. And through that, then of course, cover ministries and just get a sense of how this country works, how policy works, who are the people who influence, happenings. And it's over that time that I have kind of, branched out into various fields. I've written about neuroscience, I've written about nuclear physics, I've written about genetic engineering, GM, or early AI. I've seen several cycles of AI before, AI has now become a fashionable term that everybody kind of discusses. And yes, and of course, I've covered climate purely from the sense of science, right from CO2 interactions, particle aerosols. I always had colleagues, interestingly, I never really covered the environment beat because I always had other colleagues in my paper itself who were more focused on environment. Some of them used to go for COPs, and I just never really take a close look other than the IPCC reports. It was since 2007, I think that IPCC became a very, very big thing, and because its fifth assessment report, I believe it was, and it gave this major warnings about how apocalypse is imminent upon us. And we had so many editors asking us, oh, how long have these IPCC reports been coming? And I said, no, they've been coming since like the 90s, but you're only looking at all of these things now. And this was something which was, and again, but that again didn't really prompt an interest in environment. I still continued looking at climate science, glaciers. There were so many controversies at that point of time. When I started covering environment right from the time when, the late 2000s, when there was massive skepticism about climate science itself. I mean, there was huge respected scientists, who had problems with the IPCC interpretation of things, and it was I come from that background, so I had to unpack a lot of science, make it break it down into understandable good writing for for my audiences. And most of the papers meant in the papers that I worked in, they were very particular about telling well crafted stories that were high on accuracy, but were also interesting. So that's how I kind of started getting more and more into climate science. And now for the past 8 years I've been with the Hindu. And Hindu is a paper that has a very long tradition of science reporting. I mean, it's one of the few papers where actually there are three other people spread across bureaus who only look at science and research. So it's very rare to find papers where you have multiple reporters looking at science, and this is separate from the health and environment beats. So again, here I was looking more at policy and issues like that. But it's I had other colleagues who would go for COPs, who just spend those 14 days looking at evolutions in policy and drafts and stuff like that. But for the last 3-4 years is when I really started covering the environment sector more closely, in terms of from forestry angles, from the ministry angles, and looking at various of these issues for multiple reasons. And there was COVID in the middle. I've never really physically gone to COPs, but it's something that but the last 5-10 years, access to it has become become very simple. I mean, you can see all of the webcasts, the UNFCCC negotiations, whatever you want, and you can tune in, and you get all the reports. And there are now so many agencies, there are so many different kinds of scientific, quasi-scientific, as well as policy-based organizations that have multiple experts, who discuss various aspects of implications of of COP and COP negotiations, and the politics between countries, etc. So I have kept myself abreast, and it was this time that I thought that, okay, I mean, multiple factors came together, and I thought, let me just go and take a look at what the fuss actually is all about, and whether being physically there really makes a lot of difference. So that's how I can summarize my journey from engineering to climate and environment. And yeah, that's how it is.
That's great. I mean, it's so interesting to hear your journey, because my own journey is quite similar. And I was an engineer, then a journalist,
Oh,
and I
nice.
moved into something
Policy.
totally
Okay.
different.
Okay.
Policy, academia, and then
Yes.
now think tank. So it's kind of, I feel like I'm only transitioning, but I totally hear your first switch from journalism, from engineering, to policy. One question, it struck me that over your entire career as a journalist, like you do, obviously, given your background in engineering, you do have that data,
Yes.
analytical way of thinking about any problem and questioning everything. But one thing it struck me is, like, there are so many different topics you're covering.
Yes.
And science, even for scientists, it's a big struggle to think about. If you are an economist, you don't understand social sciences. If you are, you are I don't know, if you're a scientist in the computer science department, you have no idea the methods and other, like, how do you engage with so many different topics, research that comes out? Like, do you trust that let's just because something is published in a Nature, or even
Yes.
like pick your journal, like, do you trust that, like, because when you write academic papers, like, in the discussion and the abstract, it's a little bit more kind of easier to digest, but the rest of the stuff is so
Yes.
dense in many fields. So like, how do you digest that? How do you talk to these people? Like, how do you make sure that you got it right across so many different fields?
The simple answer is I just ask the scientists, reach out to the authors and ask them simply, and of course do a lot of background read, because I have a natural interest in many scientific fields. I do end up doing a fair amount of background reading before I actually approach scientists. Now, this is some over time is when I've kind of honed these skills. Of course, the easy way, as you just mentioned, is, if something is there in Science and Nature, these are, of course, like the top scientific journals in the world. And it would have gone through a level of, that classical peer review. Plus, in most cases, those papers are so beautifully written that the language is itself so accessible that you have a very fair sense of what the story is all about. And then, basis that, you can make a better pitch to your editors, or as to, hey, I'd like to write about this thing. But now the difficulty or the challenge really is, as even Shreya would totally empathize with, however exotic your stories are, you're writing in a daily newsroom. And you are competing with the politics guy, you're competing with the economics guy. You want story. And I've always been a daily reporter person. I am the kind of person who gets angsty if it's 3 days have passed that and I have not done some substantial story, and oh my god, I need to find something. So that's my kind of fundamental mentality. But even after you've read all this science, you have to go and explain to an editor, who, most cases, of course, people are enthused about science, but people are always asking, what is the India angle in this, or why is it relevant to our immediate readership? So that helps you to kind of read something more closely and try to connect it to, what is happening in and around the country. So I guess it's something that has now come purely by experience, because I'm reading. I mean, I read as much politics, or I read as much, in economics, things that I just taught myself, from reading over the years. And then you just kind of start making a connection, between things. Of course, my another philosophy is that if something really is interesting to me, I'm pretty sure that I can convey that interest to somebody else. But if something is fundamentally boring to me when I'm reading, I know that, unless I'm actually told to focus on this story, I will not be able to actually convey that sense of interest. So once something is interesting, I can always, and like I said, I'm very interested in the art of writing. I'm interested in coming up with great metaphors, or, I've always, I'm not very comfortable with actually this notion of simplifying the science or simplifying things to people, because I'm I'm kind of convinced over the years that we are a country which you can have sports writers write an entire section of, there is this leg cutter that went, and the ball swung like an off, and the dew was, in a particular way, and he managed a neat square drive, over long on, and I'm just mixing up some cricket terms, but sports writers routinely write these technicalities and get away with it, and they don't have to explain what these things are. So the average reader, or any reader, is very aware, has more than enough capacity to understand any aspect of science, provided you just write it well enough. It's like this is one of my, there's this quote by Steven Pinker, a cognitive neuroscientist and psychologist, and he said, just assume that the reader is somebody who's as intelligent or more intelligent than you, but just chose to take a different path in life, which is why he just probably is not familiar with certain terms that you use. But everybody can quickly see through whether what you're writing is engaging enough or interesting enough. So I've kept that kind of that thing in mind, and I've generally try to read widely. It's only thanks to journalism. And I used to always also do book, because I always also contribute fairly to feature sections in in all the papers that I read. So book reviews were this, were a lovely way to keep yourself engaged and abreast of things. Because, and I've always been fortunate that I've being science, there have been a lot of science books that have come my way, and I've read fiction, nonfiction, and engaged with different ideas, and seen some of the best science writers, kind of, engage with topics, and of course, educate myself. Now, India has presents its own challenges, and as a reporter, I have, because number one, when I started out, and this is around 2006 and 7, when I started writing science stories, the general mentality among many Indian scientists is not to really engage with reporters, because they feel that once they have written and they have published in a journal, their work is done. They don't have, there is no larger tendency that, you actually need to communicate your science or your ideas to a wider audience. Some of them have even told me that many scientists would actually think it demeaning to actually have to engage with a reporter, because they are also worried that reporters might get things wrong. They always mostly assume that, oh, these guys haven't studied science. They're probably people who have come from, different backgrounds which are non-science. So they will totally mess up the science that I have done so painfully, and, got such wonderful H indexes for. But, this is a problem that I see is becoming less and less over time, because now there is a greater engagement where, you are expected to communicate your findings. You're expected to have a large mass audience, read and engage with scientific work. But on the other hand, I'm very, very wedded to the idea of journalism, and to me journalism means criticality. So I don't see myself as somebody who writes science articles and makes the science engaging and, palatable to a wide set of audience. I can question scientists. I can question their assumptions. I can ask them, please explain to me how you arrived at this conclusion. And as you pointed out, Sandeep, many scientists are so focused on their very own narrow pond of research that many times I feel I know in certain breadth a lot more than many of them. And it's purely it's again not because of any lack of ability on either people's part. It's just that, they have, that's the nature of their field, and that's the nature of, of my field. But questioning science policy, and now that I've done this over time, I can see evolutions in stories that I once wrote about nanotechnology in the early 2010s, or the early hydrogen economy. I sometimes now see I have come full circle, and I'm writing about how everybody's now going gaga about hydrogen, etc. I'm like, oh, I remember this excitement from 15 years ago. I know where that went, and so you can actually see patterns. And I think as a journalist, that is the best thing that we can contribute to our readers, that you can give background perspective. You can tell them how things have changed over time. And, that is what the only real value add, because information is available everywhere and anywhere. There are multiple people who write lovely, well-researched stories. But, to be able to give a perspective of your country, of other countries, is, I think, what value we still, as as journalists who have been in this field around for some time, can really give. And of course, write it in a way that is engaging enough and piques curiosity. These are two philosophies that I generally abide by.
Thank you. It is very, refreshing to hear you talk about these things. These are some of the basic necessities, I guess, which all journalists should
Yeah,
ideally have. And I'm really hoping a lot of journalists should listen to this particular episode. So thank you for
I hope
spilling
so.
all these facts.
Yeah,
I'll just now
yeah,
quickly, if Sandeep doesn't have a follow up, then I like to quickly jump to the topic now.
sure.
You as you mentioned that this year you decided to go to COP28 physically and see what the whole buzz was all about, and it was
Yes.
touted to be a very contentious COP because it was happening in UAE and there were fossil fuel companies. The the COP president himself is a CEO of a company. So before we talk about the whole negotiation drama, can you tell us your experience of being there at COP? What was the atmosphere at Expo City where it happened? What was your experience, and obviously how it was different from past years?
Okay. So Shreya, I'm just going to because you're from Delhi, and I'd say my first impression of going to Expo City in there was, oh, this is like a really really big Pragati Maidan. Now Pragati Maidan, I guess for your wider audience, is this big trade fair. Is this venue in Delhi where there are multiple exhibitions happening, and to me it was just 5x at of the scale. There are multiple booths, there are pavilions by all countries, little rooms, and that's when you actually realize, even countries, your own country, how limited and small they are when you place them in the context of the world, because there are small booths from everywhere, from Israel to the United States. Each, they will have their country representatives, and they have their ministers, senior ones, who just come sit over there and are talking like regular folks. So accessing a wide range of people was an interesting experience. But other than that, uh, I saw that, I mean, there is a fair amount of cordoning off, all you know the main hub of activity. Now, negotiations, like COP negotiations, are like the major item over there, right? In terms of delegations from different countries, they are trying to craft this agreement in the next 2 weeks, and it is every day there are discussions on the kind of language to use, etc. So for some reason, I just thought that many of these delegations and ministerials would be just a stone's throw away, and I can just, being a classic reporter, I can just hang around the doors, and there'll be some guy rushing out, and then you just pounce on that guy and ask them for a quote or something. But I realized that's not how these things happen at all, because there is a media center where everybody is cordoned. All the media of the world is sitting, and the negotiations actually happen in these huge halls, which are all closed doors and cordoned off. But the access to information is also pretty high, because in the media rooms you have these TV screens, where you can find out which meeting is happening where at what time, but it explicitly tells you who all can attend, and most of them actually said open to everybody except press and media. So that I was that was one of those things that I saw. But there are multitudes of press conferences, and you finally get a sense of listening to people, not just from your own Indian experts, or people that you have been talking to for a long time, but you get you get to meet people from lots and lots of other organizations, and that really helps with getting a sense of how other people are looking at the same process that you do. So of course, other than that, it was extremely kind of hot, but you also get a sense of how much energy is being consumed in this in this particular place, because it's a place that, I mean, it was winter and it wasn't searing hot, but it was there would be some places I'd go to and I could see that this AC is turned off so incredibly high over here. It's tundra level freezing, and I'm thinking that here is this meeting where we've all gathered together to to think and ponder about wasteful cooling, and how to minimize emissions from excessive cooling or heating. So all of those contrasts and ironies were constantly hitting, but it was excellent, because you see delegations from islands like the Marshall Islands, from Samoa, activists, people. There are a lot of people who have come to voice their concerns. There were I mean, the UAE is not exactly a kind of free media society like even India or many other places. And there were a few protests here and there, but coming from India, it just felt pretty tepid. It was not as engaging as. And there were several other journalists. There are two or three of them. Who I know, who have been covering COPs for at least 10, 15 years, and they physically on the ground. And they said that these protests aren't really as much as what we've seen in other places. But the the interesting bit, of course, as you mentioned, was Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, and right from year one, when he was the president designate, it was literally the first thing on everybody's mind that here is this guy who is the CEO of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and he's also the COP president designate. Now, isn't that a rank hypocrisy? And will this mean that isn't he just opening the doors to the oil lobby and oil producers? Can we really have a meaningful, impartial assessment by the president designate of how whether he will stick to the science and be more focused towards capturing emissions and at the same time potentially risking the economy of his part of the world. So but my personal engagement with that was this was something that was there on his mind too. And even prior to the COP, he had a couple of press conferences where these questions were again and again asked of him, and he responded. His basic argument was that it is because who I am and my position that I will be able to engage with a wider section of the world. COPs are not just about delegations and ministers of countries coming in. The fact is that you have to engage with the private industry, because let's face it, they are the guys who run the companies that trigger all this all this fossil fuel emissions. And that is how we actually that is how I believe this whole conversation about needing to deliver some kind of big bang on fossil fuels actually came, because it was a bit of a surprise, because following what we had seen in Glasgow in COP26, the conversation was all about coal. That is, you need to, again, following from IPCC reports, which say that you first have to phase out unabated coal by 2030 or 2050, and then you move on to oil and gas progressively. And of course, in Sharm el Sheikh, these conversations were there in the background, but it got more focused towards the loss and damage fund and things like that. But I think that it was Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber's position as this head of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company that kind of put this whole thing about fossil fuels as a headlining moment. And the conversation, it's almost as if he felt he was pushed into some kind of psychological corner that this is the way I'm going to shut all my critics up, and I'm going to deliver some big bang announcement on fossil fuels. So there were a lot of he took on a lot of press conferences on this, and the attack, even during the conferences, there were repeated stories. Primarily coming out of the British media. And there was this one story somewhere in the middle that came out that they got some recording of his conversation with some influential activist from a couple of weeks ago, where he said that there is no science which says that fossil fuels are absolutely essential to achieving net zero. And that was again that set off another whole whirlwind of stories. After which he did a separate conference, and after some time I could see that this guy is getting a bit tired and irritated of about asking and repeating the same thing. But that is what it is. And so that was also an interesting experience for me. In terms of watching the world's media cover one topic over a long time. You're used to going abroad and seeing you're used to two people at the center, and a press conference where everybody from different countries or different representations can ask questions. You're all done in an hour, and you all go home and you file a stories. That's an experience that I've had before. But this is something where you are consistently engaged with people over over weeks, over 2 weeks, and there are developments every day. People are trying to figure out what headway actually has been made. And that was interesting. And you could see the kind of, from the questions, you could see the implicit assumptions in what American journalists might have, or what somebody from South Africa would have, what us Indian journalists have. So that was quite a refreshing experience for me. So overall, I mean, because it was my first physical COP, I was kind of impressed with the fact about the way it was organized in terms of access to information, and in terms of how uh, you could ask all the questions that you wanted. You might not get all the answers that you wanted, but you were always in a place where you could flit between different kinds of and actually you could do multiple stories. I mean now India has staked its claim for for organizing COP 33. But I would say that it would be interesting that after 5 years there would probably be many more reporters who actually would go to COP and cover it, other than this lone representative from every newspaper who always goes, because it is impossible for one person to truly capture the whole thing. I mean, hell, we have multiple reporters for a single beat in our own little ministries over here. So how can you have just one person who covers the whole? There are many angles to many things. I mean, I wish I had like 3 or 4 more colleagues who could come, and we could all just do different aspects and uh, give a fuller picture of how things are changing. So yeah, that was pretty much what I got out of my maiden trip over there.
Great. That's a really fantastic background of what happened at this COP, and like kind of your own reflections of
Yeah.
what the COP was all about, and the whole issue with the presidency and all. I mean, I think partly, in my opinion, partly that is because of people's ignorance.
Hmm.
I think they don't understand like 60% of fossil fuels are produced by state-owned companies.
Hmm.
And so
Yes.
he's like any other government official,
Yes.
like you will. So it's kind of, it's hard for
Yes.
a lot of people who don't get those facts clear. But having said that, with your experience and now that the COP has ended, like what were some of the key hits and misses in your opinion in this COP compared to previous COPs, or just generally, like what were some of the key hits and misses
Yes.
from this COP that will be meaningful for climate action?
So as I've been seeing for many years, and even I was one of those people who, at some point of time, I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, I asked myself this question: that is this whole process actually meaningful? I mean, I saw that over time that there will be this classic narrative where, okay, COP has happened, and there is the initial stories by people saying this is going on, there is this draft, etc. happening. And there's some kind of a lull in the middle, and then towards the end you have these flurry of stories where the COP has been extended by a day and a half, and you can see people are just doing night outs, and everything is focused around an agreement. So I was a little skeptical as to really, and when the agreements come out, what is it that you see? I mean, you just see creative uses of verbs. You just see the shall has been replaced by a could, and you just see all kinds of adverbs in play, and people claiming victory that we have used transitioned instead of phase out and instead of phase down. And then you actually look at the larger picture and then realize what is the real difference between a phase out and phase down, when there is no real deadline in sight. But apparently it is considered a major breakthrough. But I can appreciate over time, and as I really started seeing it from Glasgow, is that I think it's still pretty hard to have 198 countries sit in one room, and you have to have everybody agree on every line of text as well as punctuation. I mean, going by how you see bilateral actions happen in the world, I mean, people just drop bombs, in a complete violation of conventions that, people have labored and struggled over. So you see so much arbitrariness happening in between countries. So I think it's quite a challenging and impressive fact, once you really see it objectively, that there is this truly democratic process that's happening where everybody is, at least on paper, in terms of the final agreement, fundamentally equal. But that said, to me, hits and misses ultimately boils down to whether you're a developed country or whether you're a developing country. So for developed country, and many times I have felt this notion that our final COP stories essentially reflect developed country concerns. Now, developed country concerns are fundamentally geared towards focusing on mitigation. That is, they want targets on cutting out, greenhouse gas emissions, and any kind of progress, whether any kind of progress is hailed as a major victory. So in this case, we were told that, the early drafts said that, oh, finally we have decided to phase out fossil fuels. And then it came down to phase down, and there was contentious language. And ultimately it went away from that, and we came down to this word called transition. And just by that, the very fact that now fossil fuels had been mentioned in the text, is seen as a major victory, when all the time you always assume that it was an implicit fact that it is fossil fuels explicitly that had to be cut. But no, all these years, or over 30 years of COPs, people were just talking about greenhouse gas emissions. They were not really talking specifically about the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, which is fossil fuels. And secondly, you had this conversation that somehow coal was at a different level of villainy as compared to oil and gas. And today you took these two things. Oil and gas have not, there is a special line of damnation in hell for coal, which in one of the lines of text, it says that unabated coal must come down fast. But hey, we actually got oil and gas at the same kind of equitable level as coal, and they too must be phased out too. Now, technically, that that is seen as the historic bit. But on the other hand, when you look at the perspective from India, India is always, sees it as a victory when it can avoid, it can get people to, it can get the negotiators to agree upon language which is less harsh on fossil fuels. So apparently, the early versions of the draft, it said that you should be transitioning away, as well as be replacing your fossil fuel reserves with renewable energy. You should be tripling your renewable energy sources and replace your fossil fuel resources with them. Now, that is a problem with India, because that would mean that India has to explicitly cut down and stop financing new coal projects and replace them with renewable energy sources. Now, for India's perspective, it is always seen as being talked down to. It is almost as if we have to receive prescriptions from this affluent set of the world that is primarily responsible for the climate crisis in terms of historical emissions. And now, not only have they caused this problem, they are also not letting large developing countries like India and China go along the same path and reach the same level of equity as these other two nations. And for India, the most important thing is that we're not getting any substantial money out of this whole process in terms of adaptation finance, because India, with the original UNFCCC charter in 1992, India has claimed credit that it was one of the the leading voices that actually got this language called common but differentiated responsibility. That is, we all have a role to play in cutting down greenhouse gas emissions, but everybody has different roles to play. Developed countries have to do much more than developing countries. So India has, whenever this language comes into question, and since the Paris Agreement essentially brought everybody on the same book in 2015. It said that there is no developed versus developing distinction in terms of actually having to address the emissions crisis. Because when you set targets like keeping temperatures below 2 degrees centigrade, or as they call it, as far as possible 1.5 degrees centigrade, it is not possible for any one set of countries or industries to actually do that. So India has always been wary of that language, where it is expected to actually cut out on its coal. And because it also sees that many developed countries, while they might say that we must cut down coal, they're not really doing their bit on cutting down oil and gas, especially because their economy is developed at it. And let's face it, at the end of it, you might condemn the UAE and Saudi Arabia for having their economies entirely based on oil. But fact is somebody else is buying all that oil, right? So it is as much the US's and any other developed countries roles about how they too are contributing and continue to contribute very much to the to the climate crisis. So in terms of to me, of course, that is, we have moved 1 inch ahead in terms of equating certain fossil fuels, but ultimately, when you look at it, to me the real goal always has been adaptation. Let's face it, I mean, the science very explicitly says that, if at all you have any chance at keeping temperatures to this ambitious targets like to keeping temperatures below 1.2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius, you have to take on literally very, very strong emission cuts. And this science has been known for many, many years now. But what we are seeing is that year on year emissions are actually increasing. And there's no way I see in the next 7 years or 10 years that, there will be some overnight, shift in the way we produce our goods, or in the way the world fully, channelizes or reformulates its, energy strategy. So we are nowhere going to be getting anywhere close to 1.5 or even 2 degrees centigrade. So the fact of the matter is you have to concentrate a lot more on adaptation. You have to ensure that, the world's global systems are made in such a way that the people most vulnerable, that is, the poorest, or people who are living, the closest to shorelines, they have to be given a chance. They have to be given a chance in a way that their livelihoods or their modes of living are slightly more protected than what what they are used to. But unfortunately, this conversation on adaptation is simply not happening. There was this whole movement that we should have something called a framework in place on the global goal for adaptation. That is, countries must set strong targets that by 2025 and 2030 we should be implementing plans that will demonstrate what have we actually done to make our countries more adaptable. There's been no real movement on that. There has been no acknowledgement other than lip service that yes, $100 billion per annum should have come to different countries. Other than the acknowledgement that oh, the world has largely failed in delivering on the $100 billion goal, there is no real movement on that. And somehow these things don't really get picked up as the highlight. I mean, you never see headlines like world fails to deliver on adaptation goals or something like that. It's always about reducing emissions and all that on or language like that. So that is why I feel those are the big the big misses in terms of loss and damage. Again, one of those headline things that was announced right in the first of the COP. Now I can understand COP presidencies are also, they have got huge media and PR teams working for them, and they send out press releases every every half a day. Their success is like they have to make their presidencies decisions and actions look good and look like a win. So they announce big ticket things like loss and damage where people have pledged all kinds of money. But we've seen from experience that none of this, nobody really knows, is adaptation money really adaptation? Is it, are people who most need the money actually going to get the money? And the fact is, it's, I mean, cynical me thinks that none of these things are actually ever going to materialize. There will always be legalese, and there will always be ways to ensure that money is never really directed towards places in a form that people can easily access them and use them. So for me, it's a bit of balance, in terms of what we've actually got from COP28, and I would say many more misses rather than headline hits in my viewing of things.
Good, you mentioned adaptation and loss and damage fund, because I was about to ask on that and maybe can dwell a little deeper. You are absolutely right that it was one of the biggest miss. Adaptation has not got its due. And after what happened at Sharm el Sheikh last year, where finally loss and damage fund was announced, and this year on the day
Mhm.
one, it was accepted as well, but nothing significant came out of it as far as I understand. There
Yes.
were some kind of commitments by several nations, but as you said,
Yes.
we're not sure what to make out of it. So, if you can
Yes.
talk about adaptation, what did exactly anything happen? And if you can talk in terms of perspective of India, do we stand to gain anything from this whole discussion around loss and damage fund?
Yes. So that is the essential irony at which India is. The loss and damage fund is essentially meant to benefit small island states, countries that are not as industrialized or don't have as much energy infrastructure as India, but they are most vulnerable to sea level rises, etc. So these are the countries who are already bearing the brunt of climate change. And these are the places that actually need most of the money for adaptation. Now, India also has a huge has a huge of population that will be affected by this. But at the other hand, India is also, the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. We are also, one of the top five economies, in the world, and we are burners of coal. So there have been instances in the past where smaller countries have actually said that India also must be a contributor, not really a recipient to funds like to basically adaptation and loss and damage based funds. So India does not really see itself as a major gainer from these funds, because there have been figures put out in by our energy minister, by the environment minister. Most of India's adaptation funds has been financed from its own public resources. Also a lot of wordplay involved in terms of what really counts as adaptation. I mean, you can, once upon a time, you would just improve your mangrove defenses along your coast, and it would be seen as reclamation or rehabilitation. But now you can come up with a new word called adaptation to account for it. So all this creative accounting is of course part of the game. But India's role always has been that it sees itself as a leader of the global south, and many countries, Maldives, Mauritius, they all look towards India's position. It has got a certain clout in because of its size. It has got a certain clout in world affairs, especially at negotiations like this. So India does get to make these points, but I don't see a lot of money as or benefits even from the green climate fund. I mean, billions should have come by now, but very little has actually been transferred. And there are a handful of projects that in India that have actually benefited from them. The real deal is about technology transfer. Whether will there be enough private companies or enough renewable energy startups who can get connected and who can get better access to sources of finance in the developed world. That is really what India actually is looking for. Whether its own entrepreneurs are able to access even commercial deals or commercial arrangements that help them set up new kinds of industries, especially what we're doing with the solar PV and in the wind or in the green hydrogen sectors. In at least I've been observing in the last few years, there have been several more Indian delegations of businesses, especially renewable and clean energy companies, or people who are somehow connected with carbon markets, etc. They have huge delegations that actually go to COP, and they go to COP for networking. I mean, they actually sign up. They set up meetings with different kinds of oil oil producers, bigger clean energy people, and try to get financing and funding for their projects. So India sees its role as the Indian government sees its role as being able to facilitate this, and ensure that technology is under very big technology transfer is under third peg of climate negotiations, which again is very little talked about in terms of how much technology to improve your existing power plants, etc., and make them less dependent on make them less fossil emission heavy, and uh, has actually made its way into Indian infrastructure or developing country infrastructure. That uptake has been extremely poor, and so we have to. And the fact of the matter is, we are never going to see this. It's never ever going to happen that there will be World Bank, and there will be private commercial banks who are signing out checks and telling developing countries, here is your 3 billion, here is your 100 billion. It's never going to happen that way. I mean, the best that we can actually hope for is that we try to get uh, loans or commercial grants that are fairly more accessible, fairly more affordable, and help us build our infrastructure more reliably, so that we can improve, so that we can actually shore up on our adaptation based commitments, and our own people, that is our India's poorest and most vulnerable, they can have a better quality and standard of life in this era of climate, of climate vagaries. Because now everything is turned around climate. I mean even there's a cyclone, or or monsoon rainfall, there is always the accompanying, is this climate change, 2 column article that accompanies every occurrence. So it is part of our conversation right now. And every disaster may or may not be directly linked to climate change, as scientists might tell you. It's hard. Attributing specific events is extremely hard. But let's face it, this is the reality that we live in. And the only way is, how can we really adapt our economy and improve people's chances at uh, building resilience and get better shelter against unpredictable climate events.
Fantastic. I mean, I think you've covered so many different topics, from COP to mitigation to the politics of climate at COP, but also really important topic of adaptation and loss and damage. Let me ask you a forward-looking question.
Yes.
There's two interesting things that I observed in this COP, and one is that Prime Minister Modi said that India proposes to host the COP 33 in 2028. And the second is the next year's COP is happening in Baku, literally
Yes.
almost the birthplace of oil,
Yes.
right? One of the birthplaces of oil. One can dispute which one is really. But so, what does these events, what does it mean that the future COP is in an oil producing nation? The next COP, will we see similar kind of charged blames and counter
Yeah.
like counter arguments about, like, oh, an oil nation is hosting this, and then how does India start creating that roadmap for its COP, for its success? I mean, India just finished its G20 presidency, so it's a two-legged questions. You can go in chronological order if you like.
Sure. So, of course, the oil factor is going to be talked about, but I really don't see it as occupying the same kind of conversation, level of conversation as it did in Dubai over here. Because, I would expect, in Baku, there is going to be a larger conversation about, I don't know, Azerbaijan's questionable human rights record vis-a-vis the Armenians, the conflict with the Armenians over there. So I would see issues like that actually, surface over there. But I think COP28 has kind of normalized this process that you are going to have to engage more and more with oil and gas and fossil fuel, uh, and the big producers. And whether another economy is dependent on it or not is a secondary thing, because as we just earlier discussed this, the whole world is dependent on fossil fuel. I mean, if you're not a buyer, you are a seller. It is kind of a little hypocritical actually to say that, oh, my country's, we are only addicted to oil, but we're not addicted to coal, so that makes us better than you. Or we just buy oil for our as strategic reserves, and we are not really a full blown petro state as Saudi Arabia or the UAE. I think those are just very kind of morally dubious kind of angles. So I think now Azerbaijan is again a country that will be it is what it is. I mean, it is dependent on oil, and given that we have kind of equalized oil over here, there will be some, made at par that all fossil fuels are equally bad. We will see some kind of conversation going ahead, but I would see that the next COP would be, as they say, it will be more on setting up new targets for new and quantified goal on climate finance. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, that the $100 billion per year that developed countries are supposed to transfer to developing countries as part of as in Copenhagen, as they realized that was in 2009, and it has been so many years since then, and very little of that money is actually transferred. So now, not only is that money pending, but now there has been a decision or the realization that you don't need billions, you need trillions of dollars for adaptation. So I think that is going to be one of the targets, at Azerbaijan. And just as we made a lot of noise about the loss and damage fund being passed in Sharm el Sheikh, I would imagine that some kind of headline statement saying that new goal worth some big unfathomable number will be the headline over there, and that will be the measure of the success of that particular COP. Regarding India, I would see that it would be, we have 5 years now. I mean, there are so many decisions to be taken, because normally these decisions are only taken 2 years before the actual COP is hosted in the country. But I would say that a 5-year advance has got some levels of political overtones in that. So let us wait and see how that actually pans out, because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of issues in terms of location, venue, whether we are whether our infrastructure is great enough to have so many people converge at the same time. But I'm sure that we can, because G20 is there, but G20 was just ministerial people. I mean, this time we're going to have journalists, we're going to have huge delegations parked over a really, really long time. So that's going to be an interesting thing to look forward to. But it would really, really serve India's interests if actually India kind of stepped out of this narrative of just of going by this narrative of mitigation, or whether we have set out new targets for gas or or oil. If India can direct conversation towards adaptation, towards kind of generating a concise, focused statement or commitment on actually getting countries to do more on climate finance, on getting more affordable loans towards countries that need them. If we can somehow get some kind of declaration on that, something like how in Chile, I think that would be a true measure of success and would actually reflect the purpose of having a COP in a large developing country, like India. Of course, it's 5 years now, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of commentary on it. So it's something that we should wait and watch, in my reckoning.
Great. What a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. And, it was so nice to hear you. I didn't want to interrupt and ask something. So thanks again. It was a great conversation. I hate to do it, but we have to close the conversation now. But thanks again for joining us here and, giving us such a different and I would say a refreshing side of all these discussions that we were having about COP. So thanks again.
Thanks, Shreya.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed both your journey, but also kind of your reflections as somebody, understanding the science, but also engaging with policy, and the intersection was beautiful. Thank you.
Great. It was a pleasure, Sandeep, and thanks a lot again for inviting me, and all the best. And I hope many people, get some kind of ideas and new insights into their daily lives based on our conversation. Thanks a lot for having me again.
Hope so too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow @TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts @Shreya_Jay and @Sandeep Pai with a double I.